Brought to you by wikivd.com. Charles de Gaulle. Charles-André Joseph-Marie de Gaulle was a French general and statesman. He was the leader of Free France and the head of the Provisional Government of the French Republic. In 1958, he founded the Fifth Republic and was elected as the President of France, a position he held until his resignation in 1969. He was the dominant figure of France during the Cold War era, and his memory continues to influence French politics. Born in Lille, he graduated from Saint-Cyr in 1912. He was a decorated officer of the First World War, wounded several times, and later taken prisoner at Verdun. During the interwar period, he advocated mobile armored divisions. During the German invasion of May 1940, he led an armored division which counterattacked the invaders. He was then appointed Under-Secretary for War, refusing to accept his government's armistice with Nazi Germany. De Gaulle exhorted the French population to resist occupation and to continue the fight in his appeal of the 18th of June. He led a government in exile and the Free French forces against the Axis. Despite frosty relations with Britain, and especially the United States, he emerged as the undisputed leader of the French resistance. He became head of the Provisional Government of the French Republic in June 1944, the interim government of France following its liberation. As early as 1944, de Gaulle introduced a dirigiste economic policy, which included substantial state-directed control over a capitalist economy, which was followed by 30 years of unprecedented growth. Frustrated by the return of petty partisanship in the new Fourth Republic, he resigned in early 1946, but continued to be politically active as founder of the RPF party. He retired in the early 1950s and wrote his war memoirs, which quickly became a classic of modern French literature. When the Algerian War was ripping apart the unstable Fourth Republic, the National Assembly brought him back to power during the May 1958 crisis. De Gaulle founded the Fifth Republic with a strong presidency, and he was elected in that role. He managed to keep France together while taking steps to end the war, much to the anger of the Pieds-Noirs and the military. Both previously had supported his return to power to maintain colonial rule. He granted independence to Algeria and progressively to other French colonies. In the context of the Cold War, de Gaulle initiated his politics of grandeur, asserting that France as a major power should not rely on other countries, such as the US, for its national security and prosperity. To this end, de Gaulle pursued a policy of national independence, which led him to withdraw from NATO's military integrated command and to launch an independent nuclear development program that made France the fourth nuclear power. He restored cordial Franco-German relations to create a European counterweight between the Anglo-American and Soviet spheres of influence. However, he opposed any development of a supranational Europe, favoring a Europe of sovereign nations. De Gaulle openly criticized the U.S. intervention in Vietnam and the exorbitant privilege of the U.S. dollar. In his later years, his support for an independent Quebec and his two vetoes against Britain's entry into the European Community generated considerable controversy. Although re-elected president in 1965, in May 1968 he appeared likely to lose power amid widespread protests by students and workers, but survived the crisis with backing from the army and won an election with an increased majority in the assembly. De Gaulle resigned in 1969 after losing a referendum in which he proposed more decentralization. He died a year later at his residence in Colombey-les-Deux-Églises, leaving his presidential memoirs unfinished. Many French political parties and figures claim the Gaullist legacy. De Gaulle was ranked as le plus grand Français de tous les temps. Childhood and origins. De Gaulle was born in the industrial region of Lille in the Nord department, the third of 5 children. He was raised in a devoutly Catholic and traditional family. His father, Henry de Gaulle, was a professor of history and literature at a Jesuit college who eventually founded his own school. Henry de Gaulle came from a long line of parliamentary gentry from Normandy and Burgundy. The name is thought to be Flemish in origin, and may well derive from Van der Waal. De Gaulle's mother, Jean, descended from a family of wealthy entrepreneurs from Lille. She had French, Irish, Scottish, Flemish, and German ancestry. The family had lost most of its land in the French Revolution, which it opposed. De Gaulle's father encouraged historical and philosophical debate between his children at meal times, and through his encouragement, de Gaulle grew familiar with French history from an early age. Struck by his mother's tale of how she cried as a child when she heard of the French capitulation to the Germans at Sedan in 1870, he developed a keen interest in military strategy. He was also influenced by his uncle, also called Charles de Gaulle, who was a historian and passionate Celticist who wrote books and pamphlets advocating the union of the Welsh, Scots, Irish and Bretons into one people. His grandfather Julien Philippe was also a historian, and his grandmother Josephine Marie wrote poems which impassioned his Christian faith. Education and intellectual influences. By the time he was 10, he was reading medieval history. De Gaulle began his own writing in his early teens, especially poetry, and later his family paid for a composition, a one-act play in verse about a traveler, to be privately published. A voracious reader, he later favored philosophical tomes by such writers as Bergson, Peggy, and Bars. In addition to the German philosophers Nietzsche, Kant and Goethe, he read the works of the ancient Greeks and the prose of the Romanticist poet Chateaubriand. De Gaulle was educated in Paris at the Collège Stanislas and studied briefly in Belgium, where he continued to display his interest in reading and studying history, and shared the great pride many of his countrymen felt in the nation's achievements. At the age of 15 he wrote an essay imagining General de Gaulle leading the French army to victory over Germany in 1930. He later wrote that in his youth he had looked forward with somewhat naive anticipation to the inevitable future war with Germany, to avenge the French defeat of 1870. France, during de Gaulle's teenage years, was a divided society, with many developments which were unwelcome to the de Gaulle family: the growth of socialism and syndicalism, the legal separation of church and state in 1905, and the reduction in the term of military service to 2 years in the same year. Equally unwelcome were the Entente Cordiale with Britain, the First Moroccan Crisis, and above all the Dreyfus Affair. Henry de Gaulle came to be a supporter of Dreyfus, but was less concerned with his innocence per se than with the disgrace which the army had brought onto itself. The same period also saw a resurgence in evangelical Catholicism, the dedication of the Sacré-Cœur, Paris, and the rise of the cult of Joan of Arc. From July 1906, de Gaulle worked harder at school as he focused on winning a place to train as an army officer at the military academy, Saint-Cyr. Lacouture suggests that de Gaulle joined the army, despite being by inclination more suited to a career as a writer and historian, partly to please his father and partly because it was one of the few unifying forces which represented the whole of French society. He later wrote that, "When I entered the army, it was one of the greatest things in the world." A claim which Lacouture points out needs to be treated with caution. The army's reputation was at a low ebb in the early 1900s after the Dreyfus affair. It was used extensively for strike-breaking, and there were less than 700 applicants for Saint-Cyr in 1908, down from 2,000 at the turn of the century. Thank you for watching. Brought to you by wikivd.com. Please like and subscribe below. Please like and subscribe below.